At 55, Thomas Walker had lost everything he had spent 3 decades building. His small business had collapsed under mounting debt, his warehouse stood empty, and the bank had taken nearly everything he owned. With only $75 left in his pocket, he did something that made everyone at the county auction laugh. Instead of buying tools, furniture, or anything he could resell, he bought an abandoned weather station sitting alone on a forgotten mountaintop. People called it the worst purchase of the day. They said the building was falling apart, the equipment was worthless, and no one had worked there in years. Even Thomas wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But on his very first night inside the old station, he noticed a weather journal lying open on a dusty wooden desk, as though someone had only stepped outside for a moment. That single notebook led him to dozens more hidden away in forgotten cabinets and attic shelves. Together, they contained 80 years of handwritten observations, storms, blizzards, droughts, hurricanes, and the quiet lives of the men and women who had faithfully watched the sky long before satellites ever existed. What Thomas uncovered wasn't buried treasure. It was something far more valuable, a forgotten piece of American history that had quietly helped protect thousands of lives. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Whether it's morning, afternoon, or late at night, I hope you're having a wonderful day. If stories like this inspire you, please leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and let's discover together how one abandoned weather station changed a broken man's life forever. Thomas Walker sat alone inside his aging pickup truck, watching movers carry the last shelves out of the warehouse that had once housed the business he had spent more than 30 years building. The faded sign above the loading dock still bore the company name in peeling blue letters, but by sunset, it would belong to the bank. The auction had ended that morning. Every tractor part, every toolbox, every forklift, and every piece of office furniture had been sold to pay creditors who were still left unsatisfied. He had delayed this day as long as he could, believing another contract or another good season might save him. But rising costs and shrinking orders had slowly erased everything he owned. At 55, he was leaving with a pickup truck, a duffel bag of clothes, and $75 folded carefully inside his wallet. He rested both hands on the steering wheel and looked one final time at the empty building. It had given him purpose for most of his adult life. Now it looked like it had never belonged to him at all. His wife had passed away nearly 8 years earlier, and ever since then, the business had become both his livelihood and his distraction. Without either, the silence felt heavier than ever. He started the engine and drove away without looking back again. For the next several days, Thomas stayed wherever he could. One night in a roadside motel, another in his truck at a campground, then another in a supermarket parking lot where no one asked questions. He searched for work, but most employers wanted younger men willing to start over at the bottom. He filled out applications anyway, accepting polite smiles that rarely turned into phone calls. Each rejection reminded him how quickly experience could become invisible. On Friday morning, he stopped at a small diner for coffee. A folded community newspaper sat beside the sugar dispenser. While waiting for breakfast, he glanced through the classified section until a notice near the bottom caught his attention. The county government was auctioning several unused public properties and surplus equipment. Most listings were ordinary storage sheds, maintenance trailers, and abandoned utility buildings. One item stood out because it sounded almost unbelievable. Former mountain weather observation station, sold as is. There was no photograph, only a brief description and the minimum opening bid of $75. Thomas almost laughed. He had no reason to buy an abandoned weather station. He barely had enough money to buy groceries. Yet something about the listing lingered in his thoughts long after he folded the newspaper. At least it would be a roof over his head. The auction took place the following afternoon inside a county maintenance garage. A few dozen buyers wandered between tables studying photographs and property descriptions. Contractors discussed storage buildings. Farmers looked at used equipment. Investors circled anything that might produce a profit. Thomas quietly found the page describing the weather station. According to the paperwork, it sat on a mountain nearly 40 miles from the nearest town. The observation program had ended years earlier. Utilities had been disconnected except for a small backup solar system. The building required repairs. No warranties, no guarantees. Several men nearby chuckled when they noticed the listing. "Who'd want that old place?" one asked. Another shook his head. "Cost more to drive up there than it's worth." Thomas listened without saying anything. When bidding reached the weather station, the auctioneer repeated the opening price. $75. The room remained silent. He waited several seconds before quietly raising his bidder card. 75. A few people turned toward him with puzzled expressions. One man laughed openly. "Congratulations," he muttered. "You just bought yourself a pile of rotten boards." The auctioneer looked around the room once more. No additional bids came. The gavel struck the podium. "Sold." Thomas signed the paperwork, counted out nearly every dollar remaining in his wallet, and accepted a single brass key attached to a weathered metal tag marked simply Station 14. As he walked toward the parking lot, he wondered whether he had made the most foolish decision of his life. Still, for the first time in weeks, he knew where he was going. The drive into the mountains took nearly 2 hours. Paved roads gradually narrowed into winding gravel tracks, climbing through dense pine forests. Cell service disappeared long before he reached the final ridge. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through towering trees as the old weather station finally appeared above the road. It was smaller than Thomas expected. A modest wooden building stood beside a narrow observation tower supporting rusted weather instruments that had not turned in years. Tall grass surrounded the property. Several shutters hung crooked from broken hinges, yet despite the neglect, the structure remained standing with quiet dignity, as though it had simply been waiting for someone to return. Thomas unlocked the front door. It resisted at first before opening with a long creak. Cool air carrying the scent of old wood and dust drifted outside. Inside, he found a single main room lined with shelves, cabinets, and faded weather charts pinned to corkboards. An old barometer still hung on one wall. A rain gauge rested beside a window. The desk beneath the observation windows remained exactly where someone had left it years before. Dust covered every surface, but nothing looked vandalized or destroyed. It felt less abandoned than forgotten. Thomas walked slowly through each room, checking the roof for leaks, testing the floors beneath his boots, and opening windows to let fresh air inside. The building needed work, but it was solid enough to shelter him. As evening shadows stretched across the mountains, he returned to the main desk, brushing away a thick layer of dust with his sleeve. Only then did he notice something unusual. Resting in the center of the desk was a weather journal, lying open to its final handwritten page. The ink had faded slightly with age, but the notebook looked as though someone had closed it only moments before stepping outside, leaving Thomas staring silently at the unfinished story before him. Thomas spent his first night inside the weather station, wrapped in an old blanket on the wooden floor beside the desk. The building groaned softly as the mountain wind pushed against its weathered walls. and every unfamiliar sound reminded him how far he was from town. Yet despite the cold and the uncertainty, he slept more peacefully than he had in weeks. At least the station belonged to no bank, no landlord, and no one expecting another payment. When morning sunlight filtered through the dusty observation windows, he stood quietly for several minutes, watching thin clouds drift across the valleys below. It was the first time in months that he had awakened somewhere without immediately worrying about another bill or another phone call from creditors. The station needed work, but it also offered something he had nearly forgotten: silence. He began cleaning as soon as breakfast was finished, using an old broom he found in a storage closet. Thomas swept years of dust from the wooden floors, opened every window to let fresh mountain air circulate, and carried broken chairs and rotten cardboard boxes outside. Several shelves held faded weather manuals, cracked glass instruments, and stacks of blank reporting forms that had yellowed with age. Nothing appeared valuable. Yet Thomas found himself handling every item with unexpected care, as though the people who had worked here deserved that much respect. By late morning, the main room looked noticeably brighter. Sunlight reached corners that had probably not seen daylight in years. He returned to the weather journal lying open on the desk. The final page contained only neat handwriting recording ordinary observations: temperature, wind direction, cloud cover, rainfall. Every line was written with remarkable precision. There were no dramatic stories or emotional reflections, only careful notes describing the sky above the mountain. Curious. Thomas turned back several pages. Day after day, the entries followed the same pattern: measurements taken at regular hours, changes in pressure, passing storms, snowfall totals. Occasionally, a brief sentence mentioned repairing equipment or clearing snow from the observation deck, but the focus always returned to the weather. Whoever had written the journal believed every detail mattered. As he carefully closed the notebook, something caught his attention. A small handwritten label on the inside cover read, Volume 80. Thomas frowned. If this was the 80th volume, where were the others? He looked around the room again. The bookshelves held manuals, but no matching journals. The cabinets contained spare instruments and maintenance supplies. Nothing explained the missing collection. The question lingered in his mind as he resumed cleaning. Around noon, the sound of an approaching truck echoed along the gravel road. Thomas stepped outside just as an older green pickup came to a stop near the station. A gray-haired man climbed out slowly, wearing faded work boots and an old Forest Service jacket. "Morning," the stranger called. "Didn't expect to see anyone up here again." Thomas introduced himself and explained that he had purchased the station at the county auction only days earlier. The older man smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Name's Ben Collins. Worked maintenance for the Weather Service years ago. I heard someone finally bought the old place and figured I'd see if the rumors were true." Thomas invited him inside. Ben walked through the building with quiet familiarity, occasionally stopping to touch an old instrument or glance toward the observation tower. "Still standing better than I expected," he said. "We always hoped somebody would save it." Thomas asked whether many people had worked there. Ben nodded. "More than most folks realize. Different observers came and went over the decades. Some stayed a few years. Others spent most of their careers watching this mountain." His eyes settled briefly on the weather journal resting on the desk. "Looks like you found one." "Just this one," Thomas replied. "It says Volume 80. Ben looked mildly surprised. "Then maybe the rest are still here somewhere." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You mean they weren't removed when the station closed?" Ben shook his head. "As far as I know. Nobody ever finished packing everything. Budget cuts came fast. People retired, equipment was moved out. But records, he shrugged gently. Sometimes records get forgotten. Before leaving, Ben pointed toward a narrow staircase leading into the attic storage space above the main room. Used to keep old supplies up there. Haven't looked inside for years. He paused at the doorway. Take care of this place. It watched over these mountains for a long time. After Ben drove away, Thomas stood looking at the staircase for several moments before climbing the narrow wooden steps. The attic was cramped beneath the sloping roof. Dust floated through beams of sunlight, entering small vents beneath the eaves. Broken crates, worn toolboxes, and outdated measuring equipment filled most of the space. At first glance, it appeared no different from any forgotten storage room. Then he noticed several wooden chests stacked neatly beneath a canvas tarp against the far wall. Unlike the surrounding clutter, they had been arranged carefully. Thomas pulled the tarp aside. Each chest carried a small painted number. He lifted the lid of the nearest one. Inside lay row after row of weather journals, their dark covers worn smooth by decades of use. Every volume had been labeled by year. His pulse quickened as he realized there were far more than he had imagined. Before he could examine them further, another vehicle pulled into the driveway below. Thomas climbed down from the attic and stepped outside to find a woman unloading camera equipment and notebooks from a small SUV. She introduced herself with an easy smile. "I'm Dr. Rachel Evans. I'm a historian specializing in early American weather observation. Ben called me this morning." Thomas invited her inside, explaining what he had just discovered. Rachel followed him into the attic without hesitation. The moment she saw the rows of journals, she stopped speaking altogether. After several silent seconds, she carefully removed the first volume from the crate and brushed dust from its cover. Her eyes widened as she read the date stamped beneath the title. She looked back at Thomas almost in disbelief. "This isn't just a collection," she whispered. "The first journal begins in 1945. Thomas and Rachel carried the first crate of weather journals downstairs with the care usually reserved for fragile family heirlooms. They cleared the large wooden observation table, laying several clean cloths across its surface before placing the oldest volumes in a neat row. Morning light poured through the wide windows overlooking the mountain valleys, illuminating dust that drifted lazily through the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt appropriate. The journals had remained untouched for years, perhaps decades, waiting for someone willing to open them again. Rachel carefully lifted the volume marked 1945 and rested it in front of her. The leather cover was cracked with age, but the pages inside had survived remarkably well. She turned to the opening entry and smiled quietly. "The handwriting is beautiful," she said. Thomas leaned closer. Every page followed the same disciplined format: date, time, temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, cloud cover, rainfall. Each observation had been recorded with extraordinary precision. There were no crossed-out lines, hurried notes, or careless measurements. Whoever had written the journal treated each day with equal importance, whether the mountain stood beneath clear blue skies or violent storms. Rachel examined several pages before speaking again. These weren't casual records. This was professional work. Thomas nodded. Though he understood little about meteorology, even he could see the remarkable consistency. The observer had followed the same routine every single day. "Read this," Rachel said, pointing toward a short paragraph written beneath the weather observations several months into the journal. Unlike the measurements above it, the handwriting became slightly more personal. Heavy fog delayed the morning readings. Mrs. Harris from the valley delivered fresh bread on her way home. She worries another dry summer may hurt the apple orchards. Thomas smiled faintly. It was the first glimpse of the person behind the numbers. The journal continued in much the same way. Most pages contained only weather observations, but every few weeks a brief note appeared about repairing instruments, replacing a broken window, helping travelers caught in unexpected snow, or sharing supper with nearby ranching families. The mountain no longer felt isolated. It had quietly connected many lives. They opened the next volume. The handwriting changed. Rachel immediately noticed the difference. "Different observer," she said. The format remained identical, but the letters were slightly larger and the wording subtly different. The first page explained why. "Station duties assumed today following the retirement of Mr. Howard Ellis. I will continue the record exactly as he requested." Thomas looked up. So every new observer continued where the last one stopped. Rachel nodded. Not only the measurements, the responsibility. As the afternoon passed, they sampled journals from different decades instead of reading every page. Each volume introduced a new caretaker of the station. Some remained only a few years before another name appeared. Others filled multiple journals over long careers. Yet every transition followed the same quiet promise. Continue the work. Maintain the record. Protect the history. The continuity amazed Thomas. 80 years, he said softly. Different people. One conversation. Rachel smiled. That's exactly what this is. She began making notes in her own notebook, recording dates, names, and visible changes in observation methods. Occasionally, she stopped to photograph a page that contained unusually detailed entries. "Do you realize how rare this could be?" she asked. Weather stations kept records, of course, but uninterrupted collections like this almost never survive in one place. Thomas looked around the station. Funny. People at the auction thought the whole building was worthless. Rachel laughed quietly. History often survives because everyone assumes it has no value. Later that afternoon, Ben Collins returned carrying a small toolbox. "Thought I'd help you fix that front step," he said. Thomas thanked him and invited him inside before they began working. Ben immediately noticed the journals spread across the observation table. His expression softened. "I never imagined they'd still be here." Rachel asked whether he recognized any of the names listed in the later volumes. Ben studied several pages before pointing toward one signature. "Frank Delaney. I met him once when I was a young technician. Quiet fellow. Always said the mountain taught patience better than people ever could." Another name brought back memories of a woman who maintained the station through several harsh winters. Ben remembered how she refused to miss a single observation despite heavy snowfall. His stories added life to names that otherwise existed only in fading ink. Thomas listened carefully, realizing that each journal represented not simply weather reports, but years of someone's daily routine, discipline, and quiet dedication. Before leaving, Ben rested his hand gently on one of the volumes. "Don't let these become forgotten again," he said. "They deserve better." After Ben drove away, Rachel selected several journals from different decades to examine more closely. As evening settled outside, she noticed another pattern beyond the weather observations. Many observers occasionally described ordinary moments of mountain life. One wrote about watching migrating birds return each spring. Another mentioned teaching a new assistant how to read the instruments during a thunderstorm. Someone recorded delivering weather updates to nearby farming communities before harvest season. The journals slowly revealed personalities hidden beneath years of measurements. They were practical people who took pride in careful work, yet they also noticed beauty in changing seasons and remembered neighbors by name. Thomas found himself unexpectedly drawn into their lives. He had arrived at the station believing he had purchased little more than an abandoned building. Now he realized he had stepped into the middle of a story carried forward by generations of strangers. As darkness filled the windows, Rachel opened one of the final journals in the collection. A folded sheet of paper slipped gently from between the pages. It was not a map or an official report, only a handwritten note placed carefully near the end of the volume. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words remained perfectly readable. Rachel unfolded it slowly and read the final sentence aloud. "If someone finds these," she whispered, "don't let them disappear." Neither of them spoke afterward. The room grew quiet except for the wind moving gently around the old weather station, while the simple message rested between them like a promise, waiting for someone to accept it. The following morning, Thomas and Rachel began organizing the weather journals by decade, spreading carefully labeled stacks across the observation table. What had first appeared to be nothing more than weather records slowly revealed something much richer. Every observer had signed the first page of each new volume before continuing the routine established by the previous caretaker. Dates changed, handwriting changed, lives changed, yet the commitment never did. Rachel created a timeline on several sheets of paper, matching names, years, and transitions between observers. By midday, she had identified 7 principal caretakers who had worked at the station from 1945 until its closure. "It's almost like reading the history of one family," Thomas said. Rachel smiled. "Not by blood, by responsibility." They began following each observer through the journals instead of reading them chronologically. The first, Howard Ellis, filled the earliest volumes with steady observations and occasional notes about repairing instruments damaged by harsh winters. His successor thanked him for teaching the discipline required to maintain accurate records. Decades later, another observer mentioned learning the same lessons from someone else. The journals quietly documented knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Thomas found himself caring about people he had never met. Their lives unfolded not through dramatic stories, but through ordinary routines repeated with remarkable dedication. One observer described carrying replacement thermometer tubes up the mountain after a storm washed out the road. Another wrote about spending Christmas alone at the station, while nearby families left homemade meals on the front porch. A woman named Margaret Lewis recorded teaching local school children how weather instruments worked during summer visits. None of these entries occupied more than a few sentences, yet together they painted a picture of lives lived with quiet purpose. Rachel paused over one journal from the early 1960s. "Listen to this," she read aloud. "Heavy snowfall expected overnight. Farmers in the Eastern Valley notified before sunset." A few pages later, another brief note appeared. "Received word today that livestock were moved before the storm. No major losses reported." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. They weren't just watching the weather. People depended on them. The pattern repeated again and again. Several journals mentioned early warnings before severe thunderstorms, unusually dry seasons, or dangerous cold fronts. The observers never praised themselves. They simply recorded what had happened before moving on to the next day's measurements. Rachel quietly closed the volume. "History remembers satellites and computers," she said. "But before all that, communities depended on people like these." During the afternoon, Ben Collins returned carrying a cardboard box filled with old maintenance photographs he had found in his garage. Together, they spread the faded pictures across the table. Several showed the weather station decades earlier with fresh paint, newer instruments, and observers standing proudly beside the observation tower. Ben identified as many faces as he could remember. "That's Frank Delaney," he said, pointing toward a smiling man adjusting an anemometer. "And over here is Margaret Lewis." She was the one who always insisted children should understand the weather instead of fearing it. Rachel compared the photographs with names written inside the journals. Slowly, the anonymous authors became real people. Thomas noticed something remarkable. Every photograph showed ordinary men and women smiling beside simple equipment. There were no ceremonies, awards, or celebrations, just people doing their jobs. As the afternoon light softened, Rachel opened a journal covering the years of one particularly destructive storm season. Entry after entry documented changing pressure, increasing wind speeds, and repeated warnings sent to nearby communities. The observer remained calm throughout every page, never dramatizing the danger, despite the obvious seriousness of the conditions. Thomas imagined someone sitting exactly where he now sat, recording measurements while storms rolled across the mountains outside those same windows. "They stayed here through all of that," he said quietly. Ben nodded. "Someone always did." Later, while organizing the photographs, the sound of another vehicle climbing the gravel road interrupted the peaceful afternoon. A dark SUV stopped outside the station. A neatly dressed man stepped out and introduced himself as Mark Sullivan. He explained that he represented an investment group interested in purchasing several mountain properties surrounding the area. After politely admiring the restored condition of the station, he asked whether Thomas might consider selling. "The location has potential," Mark said. "We're exploring recreational development nearby. I'd be happy to discuss a fair price." Thomas glanced toward the observation room where dozens of journals remained spread across the table. Only a week earlier, he might have accepted almost any reasonable offer simply to rebuild his finances. Now the thought felt strangely different. He smiled politely. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think I'm ready to sell." Mark accepted the answer without argument. "If you change your mind, here's my card." After he drove away, Thomas slipped the business card into a drawer without another look. Rachel noticed the decision but said nothing. She simply returned to the journals. As evening approached, they opened another of the oldest volumes. Tucked inside its back cover rested a folded sheet of aging paper that had gone unnoticed beneath several loose pages. Thomas carefully unfolded it. It was not another letter. Instead, it was a hand-drawn map of the weather station property and the surrounding hillside. Most landmarks were familiar, but one location had been marked with a small handwritten note and a simple arrow pointing toward an outbuilding behind the station. Beside it, in faded ink, were only 3 words: Archive Storage Room. Thomas looked toward the back window where an overgrown path disappeared into the trees behind the weather station. Until that moment, he had assumed every surviving record was already inside the building. Now he realized the journals might be only the beginning. The next morning, Thomas folded the hand-drawn map carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket before stepping outside with Rachel. Overnight rain had darkened the soil, and the cool mountain air carried the scent of wet pine needles. Standing behind the weather station, they could barely make out the faint outline of the overgrown footpath shown on the map. Tall grass and young saplings had nearly erased it, but scattered stones still marked where people had once walked regularly. "It hasn't been used in years," Thomas said quietly. Rachel looked at the map again. "If the archive room survived, there's a chance more records did too." They followed the narrow trail slowly. Fallen branches blocked sections of the path, forcing Thomas to clear the way with an old handsaw he had found inside the station. After several minutes, the trees opened into a small clearing hidden behind dense brush. A low wooden building stood there, almost invisible beneath climbing vines and moss-covered shingles. It resembled a storage shed more than an office, but its construction matched the weather station perfectly. The windows were boarded from the outside, and the heavy wooden door leaned slightly on rusted hinges. Thomas brushed leaves away from a small metal plaque fixed beside the entrance. The faded lettering simply read, "Archive Storage." Rachel smiled. The map was right. The padlock had long since rusted into place. Thomas tried the brass key marked Station 14 without success, before using a pry bar from his truck. After several careful attempts, the weakened lock finally snapped free. The old door resisted at first, then slowly swung inward with a deep groan. Cool, dry air drifted from the darkness inside. Unlike the main station, the storage room had remained sealed for years. Dust covered every surface, but little moisture had entered the building. Shelving lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Wooden cabinets filled the back half of the room, while stacked crates occupied the center aisle. Nothing appeared disturbed. It looked as though the final workers had simply locked the door and never returned. Thomas stepped carefully between the shelves while Rachel examined handwritten labels attached to several cabinets. Most contained spare instrument parts, replacement glass tubes, maintenance manuals, and supply inventories. The organization impressed her immediately. "Everything was cataloged," she said. "Whoever managed this place believed future observers would need it." Against the rear wall stood a large steel filing cabinet. Its drawers opened surprisingly easily. Inside were neatly arranged folders containing station maintenance records, equipment inspections, calibration reports, and correspondence with regional weather offices. Thomas leafed through several files without fully understanding their technical details. But Rachel's excitement grew with every folder she opened. "These records explain how the station operated," she said. "They're an incredible historical resource." Nearby, Thomas found several framed black and white photographs wrapped carefully in brown paper. They showed different generations of observers standing proudly beside the weather tower after repairs, winter storms, and equipment upgrades. One photograph included children visiting during a school field trip. Another showed volunteers clearing snowdrifts from the observation platform after an unusually harsh winter. Ordinary moments, preserved because someone believed they mattered. Ben Collins arrived later that morning after Thomas called to tell him about the discovery. The retired technician stood quietly inside the storage room, looking around with visible emotion. "I haven't been in here since the station closed," he admitted. "I'd almost forgotten how much was kept back here." He picked up an old wind gauge resting on one shelf and smiled faintly. Before weather satellites became reliable, places like this filled the gaps. These stations collected observations every day, then passed them to regional forecasting centers. Farmers planned harvests around the reports. Highway crews prepared for snow. Fire departments watched for dangerous dry conditions. It wasn't glamorous work, but people depended on it. Thomas listened carefully. The more Ben spoke, the more the weather station transformed in his mind. It was no longer an abandoned building filled with old notebooks. It had once been an active part of everyday life across the surrounding valleys. The observations recorded here had quietly helped protect families, crops, roads, and communities for decades. Rachel continued examining cabinet after cabinet until she reached a locked steel box sitting alone on the bottom shelf. Unlike the other storage containers, this one carried an official Weather Service seal. A handwritten tag attached to the handle read, "Reports Retain." "Did you ever see this?" she asked Ben. He studied the box before slowly shaking his head. "No, I don't remember that one. Thomas searched the storage room until he found a small ring of labeled cabinet keys hanging inside an old drawer. After trying several, one finally turned the lock. The heavy lid lifted slowly. Inside were dozens of carefully organized document folders tied together with cotton ribbon. Each folder contained official weather reports typed on aging government forms, accompanied by handwritten observation summaries and supporting charts. Rachel removed the first report with extraordinary care. The pages described severe weather events, recorded observations, and early warnings transmitted from the station to regional offices many years before modern forecasting systems existed. She glanced at another folder, then another. Every report appeared complete, signed, dated, and preserved in remarkable condition. Thomas watched as her expression shifted from curiosity to genuine amazement. "What is it?" he asked softly. Rachel looked up from the documents, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. "These reports were never published with the station records we already found," she said. "They've been sitting here all this time." Thomas stared into the steel box filled with forgotten files, realizing they had uncovered yet another chapter of the station's history, waiting patiently to be read. The steel box remained open on the observation table long after sunset. Thomas, Rachel, and Ben carefully sorted the official weather reports into chronological order, placing clean sheets of paper between the aging documents to protect them from further wear. Every folder contained detailed observations of severe weather events that had once threatened the surrounding counties. Unlike the daily journals, these reports explained what happened after dangerous conditions were detected. They recorded warnings sent to county offices, telephone calls placed to local sheriffs, messages delivered to farming cooperatives, and follow-up notes describing how communities responded. Thomas slowly realized the weather station had done far more than record temperatures and rainfall. It had quietly served as an early warning post for thousands of people living across the valleys below. Rachel unfolded one report dated during the early 1950s. "Listen to this," she said. "Rapid pressure drop observed before dawn. Flash flood conditions expected along the eastern river basin. Emergency notification transmitted immediately." Attached to the report was a follow-up summary completed several days later. It noted that residents had been evacuated from low-lying areas before floodwaters arrived. Property damage had still occurred, but there were no recorded fatalities. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "The warning came from here." Rachel nodded. Hours before modern forecasting systems could have reached those communities. Another report described an unusually dry summer, followed by strong winds sweeping across nearby forests. The observer recommended restricting controlled burns until conditions improved. A later note confirmed several counties had temporarily suspended outdoor burning after receiving the station's recommendation. Thomas looked toward the windows overlooking the endless pine-covered ridges. They were protecting people without anyone ever really knowing. Ben smiled quietly. That was the job. They continued reading through the reports over the next several days. Some documented approaching blizzards that allowed highway crews to prepare equipment before roads became impassable. Others warned orchard owners about dangerous late frosts, giving families enough time to protect vulnerable crops. Several reports focused on prolonged drought conditions that increased wildfire risk throughout the region. None of the documents exaggerated the observer's role. They simply presented careful measurements, reasonable conclusions, and recommendations based on experience gathered through years of watching the mountain skies. Thomas found himself admiring the discipline behind every page. These people had understood that careful observation could save lives long before anyone praised them for it. Rachel photographed each report before storing it inside archival sleeves she had brought from the university. Every evening, she compared the recovered documents against historical weather records available through state archives and public libraries. After several days of research, she returned to the station carrying a notebook filled with cross-references. "They match," she said, spreading photocopies across the observation table. Thomas studied the pages while Rachel explained. Dates from the station reports corresponded precisely with official state records describing floods, severe snowstorms, droughts, and damaging wind events. Newspaper articles from the same periods frequently mentioned early warnings received by local officials, though few identified where the forecasts originated. Rachel pointed toward one comparison. This newspaper credits county emergency managers for preparing before the flood. Their report lists the exact same observation times recorded in this station. Thomas understood immediately. The mountain observers had supplied critical information, yet their names rarely appeared anywhere outside the journals themselves. Their work had quietly supported larger systems without seeking recognition. Ben looked through another folder before speaking. That's how it usually worked. The forecast mattered. Who collected the data didn't. Thomas remained silent for a long moment. Only weeks earlier, he had believed success meant owning a profitable business with his name displayed above the door. Sitting inside the old weather station, surrounded by decades of anonymous service, he began seeing success differently. The people who worked here had measured their lives not by recognition, but by usefulness. Every carefully written page represented another day spent helping strangers they would probably never meet. The realization settled deeply within him. One afternoon, while organizing the official reports by year, Rachel noticed that several folders from the station's final decade had been signed by the same observer. Unlike earlier reports that occasionally rotated between different names, these carried one signature over and over again. "Looks like the last observer stayed here for quite a while," she said. Ben studied the signature thoughtfully. "I remember that name," he replied. "By the time I was doing maintenance work, there weren't many people left assigned to remote stations." He believed this place still mattered, even after newer technology started replacing most of the old network. Thomas wondered what it must have felt like to continue recording weather each day while knowing stations across the country were gradually closing. He imagined someone faithfully climbing the observation tower every morning, taking measurements with the same care as those who had come before, refusing to lower the standard simply because the world was changing. As evening approached, Rachel reached the bottom of the final folder inside the steel box. Beneath the official reports rested a single sealed envelope bearing the familiar Weather Service letterhead. Unlike the other documents, this envelope contained no typed forms visible through the paper. Only one handwritten signature appeared across the front. Rachel carefully turned it over and read the name aloud. It belonged to the station's final observer, the same individual whose signature appeared throughout the last years of official reports. Thomas looked at the unopened envelope resting quietly on the table. Without yet knowing what it contained, he understood they had reached the closing chapter of the weather station's long history. The sealed envelope rested on the observation table until the following morning. Neither Thomas nor Rachel wanted to rush the moment. After protecting the surrounding documents inside archival folders, Rachel carefully examined the envelope for damage before slipping a thin paper knife beneath the brittle flap. The seal opened cleanly. Inside was a neatly folded handwritten letter on official Weather Service stationery. The ink had faded slightly but remained easy to read. Rachel unfolded the pages and silently scanned the first paragraph before handing them to Thomas. "I think you should read this," she said softly. Thomas settled into the chair beside the observation window where generations of observers had once recorded the changing sky. The letter was dated only a few weeks before the station officially closed. It had been written by the final observer whose signature appeared throughout the last official weather reports. There was no bitterness in the words, only quiet acceptance. The writer described watching technology gradually replace isolated mountain stations across the country. Satellites, automated equipment, and expanding computer models had made many small observation posts unnecessary. Yet the letter insisted that the value of the station had never rested solely in its instruments. It had always rested in the people willing to show up every day, no matter the weather. Because someone depended on accurate information. Thomas lowered the pages for a moment before continuing. The writer thanked every observer who had come before him, acknowledging names Thomas now recognized from the journals spread throughout the station. Each generation had inherited the responsibility from the last, preserving not only measurements, but also a tradition of careful service. Near the end of the letter, the observer wrote that buildings eventually grow old, equipment becomes obsolete, and methods change. But dedication should never disappear simply because progress arrives. Thomas quietly folded the pages again. He wasn't writing about weather anymore, he said. Rachel nodded. He was writing about purpose. Later that morning, Thomas drove into town for supplies. While loading lumber into the back of his pickup, he noticed a familiar car pulling into the hardware store parking lot. His daughter, Lisa Walker, stepped out carrying grocery bags. She looked surprised to see him, but smiled warmly before walking over. They had spoken occasionally since his business collapsed, though never for very long. She worried about him constantly, and he often avoided telling her how difficult life had become because he disliked feeling like a burden. "I heard you bought an old weather station," she said with a gentle laugh. "People in town are talking about it." Thomas smiled. "News travels fast around here." She studied his face carefully. "You look different." He shrugged. "Maybe sleeping in a real building helps." Lisa hesitated before asking if she could visit. Thomas welcomed the idea. They drove separately up the mountain that afternoon. As soon as Lisa stepped inside the station, she paused in quiet surprise. She had expected little more than an abandoned shack. Instead, she found clean floors, organized shelves, carefully arranged journals, and sunlight pouring through polished observation windows. The building still showed its age, but it felt alive again. Rachel greeted her warmly before returning to her research, giving father and daughter time to talk. Thomas showed Lisa the observation deck, the old weather instruments, and the long rows of journals that now filled the restored shelves. He explained how each observer had continued the work of those before them, and how the official reports documented warnings that had quietly helped nearby communities prepare for floods, storms, droughts, and dangerous winter weather. Lisa listened carefully without interrupting. "I thought you bought this place because you had nowhere else to go," she admitted. Thomas looked out across the mountain valleys. "At first I did." He smiled thoughtfully. "Now I think this place found me instead." Lisa laughed softly before becoming serious again. "I haven't seen you this hopeful since Mom was alive." Her words lingered between them. Thomas realized she was right. During the years after his wife's death, he had buried himself in work until the business became the only thing defining his life. When it failed, he believed he had failed as well. The weather station had quietly changed that belief. Every journal reminded him that meaningful lives were often built through ordinary acts repeated faithfully over many years. Lisa reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "I'm proud that you didn't give up." Thomas smiled, grateful for words he had not realized he needed to hear. Before sunset, Ben arrived carrying several small boxes of spare weather instruments he had recently found while cleaning his garage. After greeting Lisa, he joined the others around the observation table. Conversation gradually turned toward the station's final years. Thomas asked the question that had been lingering in his mind ever since reading the last observer's letter. Why was this place really closed? Ben leaned back thoughtfully before answering. Not because anyone thought it failed. Quite the opposite. By the late years, technology simply changed faster than budgets could keep every remote station operating. Automated sensors and satellite observations covered much of what observers once did by hand. Officials believed they no longer needed people stationed on mountaintops. He paused before smiling gently. They weren't wrong about the technology. They just underestimated the value of everything else these people preserved. Lisa glanced toward the journals. The history. Ben nodded. Exactly. As evening settled outside, Rachel carefully returned the final observer's letter to its envelope before noticing another folded sheet tucked behind the last page. It had remained hidden because it was nearly the same color as the stationery. She carefully unfolded it and handed it to Thomas. Unlike the official letter, this page had never been addressed to any government office. It contained only a few handwritten paragraphs. Thomas read them slowly. The final observer explained that if someone someday discovered the journals, he hoped they would understand they represented far more than weather records. He asked whoever found them to protect the collection so future generations could remember the quiet people who had watched the skies before modern technology replaced them. The final sentence stood alone at the bottom of the page. If these journals ever find another caretaker, please continue protecting them for those who come after us. Thomas looked up from the letter, holding the pages carefully in both hands, silently realizing that the request had somehow found its way to him. Over the following week, the quiet mountain weather station slowly welcomed more visitors than Thomas had expected. Rachel contacted several colleagues from the university, asking them to examine the journals and official reports. A local history teacher brought 2 students interested in preserving regional archives. Ben stopped by almost every afternoon, answering questions about instruments and identifying people in old photographs. Word spread through nearby towns that an abandoned weather station had yielded decades of forgotten records. The visitors arrived with curiosity, but nearly all of them left with genuine respect. Thomas found himself giving simple tours of the building, explaining how each observer had continued the work begun by the one before. He never exaggerated the discoveries. The journals spoke for themselves. One afternoon, an elderly farmer stood quietly beside the photographs before pointing toward a familiar face. "That man warned us about a freeze when I was a boy," he said. "My father stayed up all night protecting the orchard. We never knew where the warning came from." Rachel carefully wrote down the memory in her notebook. It matched one of the journal entries they had already found. Small recollections like that continued to appear. A retired highway worker remembered receiving storm updates before dangerous mountain roads closed. Another visitor recalled hearing local radio broadcasts based on observations from the station. None of the stories changed history dramatically, yet together they confirmed what the journals had quietly recorded for decades. The station had been woven into everyday life, even if few people had noticed at the time. Thomas listened with growing appreciation. Every conversation reinforced the same lesson. Meaningful work often remained invisible until someone took the time to remember it. Rachel spent several days photographing every journal and report so digital copies could eventually be preserved alongside the originals. She explained each step to Thomas, showing him how careful handling prevented further damage. He learned to wear cotton gloves while turning fragile pages and to keep the documents away from direct sunlight. The responsibility no longer felt temporary. He wanted to care for the collection properly. One afternoon, Mark Sullivan returned to the station. His dark SUV stopped in the same place as before, but this time his expression carried genuine curiosity rather than the confidence of a businessman expecting a negotiation. Thomas greeted him politely outside. Mark glanced toward the growing number of parked vehicles. "Looks busier than last time," he observed. Thomas smiled. "People have become interested in the history." Rachel joined them and briefly explained the discoveries without revealing anything beyond what had already been documented. Mark listened carefully while looking around the restored observation room. Finally, he nodded. "I can see this place means more than I realized." He reached into his jacket, removed the business card Thomas had returned during their previous conversation, and tore it neatly in half before dropping the pieces into a recycling container beside the trunk. "I'm withdrawing my offer," he said simply. "Some properties are worth more preserved than developed." Thomas thanked him. Mark wished everyone well before quietly driving away. Rachel watched the SUV disappear down the mountain road. "That must feel good," she said. Thomas nodded. "It feels like one less thing to worry about." With outside pressure gone, work inside the station continued steadily. Shelves were cleaned, photographs cataloged, and reports organized into protective archival boxes. Lisa visited whenever her schedule allowed, often helping label folders or brush dust from restored equipment. Watching father and daughter laugh together while sorting decades-old documents brought quiet satisfaction to Ben, who often remarked that the station sounded alive again. Several evenings later, while checking the catalog Rachel had prepared, Thomas noticed something that stopped him. Every recovered weather journal had been assigned a volume number beginning with the first entry from 1945 and ending with volume 80, the journal originally found open on the observation desk. He counted the physical volumes lined across the shelves once more. Then he counted again. Rachel noticed his puzzled expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. Thomas compared the handwritten catalog with the shelves. "The numbers don't match." Together, they checked each spine carefully. The sequence progressed normally through the decades, yet one volume number was absent. There was no duplicate, no obvious mislabeling, simply a gap between two consecutive journals. Rachel immediately retrieved the inventory she had created while sorting the collection. She traced the list slowly with her finger before looking back at the shelves. "You're right," she said quietly. "One journal is missing." Thomas searched every crate from the attic, every cabinet inside the station, and every shelf in the archive storage room. Ben joined the search, convinced the volume had merely been misplaced years earlier. Lisa examined every photograph and storage box, hoping someone might have accidentally tucked the journal away with unrelated materials. By sunset, they had inspected nearly every corner of both buildings, without success. Rachel returned to the observation table and studied the remaining journals carefully. The entries before the missing volume ended normally. The journal immediately after it began with no explanation beyond the routine continuation of daily observations. Nothing suggested theft or deliberate removal. It simply seemed to have disappeared sometime after it was written. Thomas rested his hand gently on the row of surviving volumes. After everything they had uncovered together, the single empty place on the shelf seemed strangely important. He stared at the gap where one weather journal should have stood, silently wondering where the missing piece of the station's story had gone. The discovery of the missing journal changed the atmosphere inside the weather station. For several days, Thomas, Rachel, Ben, and Lisa searched methodically through every room again, refusing to believe that one carefully numbered volume had simply vanished. They removed books from shelves, opened every storage crate, checked filing cabinets, examined attic beams, and even looked beneath loose floorboards where small objects might have slipped over the years. The journal remained missing. Rachel reviewed her catalog one page at a time, comparing dates with the surviving collection. The missing volume covered only a single year, positioned between two journals that otherwise continued the station's uninterrupted record. The Observer before it ended with a routine weather entry. The following volume began the next year as though nothing unusual had happened. There was no explanation for the gap. "It doesn't feel intentional," Rachel said. "If someone wanted to hide the station's history, far more than one journal would be gone." Ben agreed. Whoever worked here respected these records too much to throw one away. Thomas looked around the observation room. Then maybe it never left the station. The thought gave them fresh determination. They shifted their attention from obvious storage areas to the weather instruments themselves. Every cabinet, display case, and workbench was inspected again. Ben explained the purpose of each surviving instrument, while Thomas checked for hidden compartments or forgotten storage spaces. Most contained nothing beyond gears, glass tubes, or worn maintenance parts. Still, each inspection deepened Thomas's appreciation for the careful craftsmanship behind the station's daily work. Late one afternoon, Ben paused beside the large antique barometer mounted on the wall near the observation desk. It had remained there since Thomas first entered the station. The polished wooden case showed signs of age, but still looked impressive despite years without maintenance. Ben frowned thoughtfully. "That's strange," he murmured. Thomas looked up. "What is?" Ben gently tapped the lower section of the barometer. The sound seemed slightly duller than expected. "I remember servicing one like this years ago. The lower compartment feels deeper than I remember." Rachel joined them while Ben carefully removed the instrument from the wall. They placed it on the observation table and examined the wooden housing from every angle. The front glass opened easily, revealing the pressure dial. But nothing appeared unusual until Ben ran his fingers along the back panel. Hidden beneath years of dust was a tiny recessed latch, almost invisible against the dark wood. "I never noticed that before," Thomas admitted. Ben pressed gently. A narrow panel released with a quiet click, revealing a shallow compartment built into the back of the instrument. Inside rested a single leather-bound journal wrapped carefully in faded cloth. No one spoke for several seconds. Thomas lifted the bundle with extraordinary care before unfolding the protective fabric. The familiar volume number appeared on the spine. It was the missing journal. Rachel smiled with visible relief. "The collection is complete." Thomas opened the journal carefully. The pages remained in excellent condition, protected for years inside the sealed compartment. The weather observations continued exactly where the previous volume had ended. There were no shocking revelations or hidden conspiracies waiting inside. Only another year of faithful work recorded by one of the station's observers. Somehow that made the discovery even more meaningful. The journal had never been separated from the station's history. It had remained safely within the building all along. As Rachel examined the opening pages, she noticed a brief handwritten note attached inside the front cover. Unlike the dramatic language found in stories, the message was simple and practical. The Observer explained that the journal had been placed inside the barometer for protection during repairs inside the station and should be returned to the shelves once the work was finished. Judging from later events, that final step had simply been forgotten before the station eventually closed. Thomas smiled quietly. No mystery after all. Ben laughed softly. Sometimes history survives because somebody forgot to finish a job. Together, they placed the recovered volume into its proper position on the shelf. For the first time since organizing the journals, every numbered space was filled. The long conversation carried across 80 years stood complete once again. Rachel photographed the recovered journal before adding it to the official catalog. She also documented the hidden compartment inside the antique barometer so future caretakers would understand where the volume had been found. Nothing about the discovery changed the larger story they had uncovered, but it restored its continuity. Every observer's contribution now stood together exactly as intended. During the following week, Rachel contacted archivists, historians, and representatives from regional historical organizations, sharing a summary of the complete collection and the official reports they had recovered. Rather than seeking publicity, she emphasized the historical importance of preserving the station's uninterrupted weather record and the lives documented within the journals. Responses arrived quickly. Several experts expressed interest in examining the materials, praising the remarkable condition of the collection and its potential value for both regional history and long-term weather research. One letter described the journals as an unusually complete record of dedicated public service preserved across generations. Another praised the official reports for documenting how local observers supported communities before modern forecasting systems became widespread. Thomas read the letters with quiet satisfaction. None celebrated wealth, fame, or personal achievement. They honored careful work carried out faithfully by ordinary people. Standing beside the shelves of restored journals, he realized the recognition belonged not to him, but to every observer whose handwriting filled the volumes. He had simply helped their voices return. As evening settled over the mountain, Thomas looked across the observation room where every journal now rested in perfect order. The collection was finally complete, and beyond the windows, the same valleys those observers had watched for decades stretched peacefully beneath the fading light, waiting for the next chapter of the station's history to begin. Several months passed before the mountain weather station settled into a new rhythm. The hurried excitement surrounding the discoveries gradually gave way to quiet, steady work, much like the routine described throughout the journals themselves. Rachel continued visiting regularly, helping organize the collection with museum-quality archival materials, while coordinating with historians interested in preserving the station's records. Ben repaired aging instruments whenever something needed attention, carefully explaining their operation to anyone curious enough to ask. Lisa came on weekends whenever she could, often bringing groceries and fresh flowers that brightened the observation room overlooking the valleys. Thomas found himself following a simple daily routine. Each morning he unlocked the station, opened the windows to let in the mountain air, dusted the observation table, checked that sunlight was not falling directly on the journals, and walked slowly through every room before sitting quietly with a cup of coffee beside the windows. The building no longer felt abandoned. It felt cared for again. Visitors continued arriving throughout the seasons. Local schools organized occasional field trips, allowing children to handle replica weather instruments, while Rachel explained how observations had once been recorded by hand. Older residents stopped by with memories that added small details to the stories already preserved inside the journals. Some recognized faces in the photographs. Others remembered hearing storm warnings on local radio broadcasts or watching weather observers climb the tower during harsh winters. Thomas listened carefully to every story, writing each one into a separate notebook so those memories would not disappear again. He noticed that many visitors entered expecting to learn about weather but left talking about people instead. They admired the discipline, kindness, and quiet responsibility carried by generations of observers who had asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to do their work well. The station had become more than a historical building. It had become a place where ordinary lives received the recognition they had quietly earned. One crisp autumn morning, Rachel arrived carrying a folder containing official correspondence from regional historical organizations. She spread the papers across the observation table where the first weather journal had been discovered months earlier. "It's finished," she said with a smile. Thomas looked over the documents while she explained. The station and its complete collection of journals, photographs, maintenance records, and official weather reports would receive formal historical recognition. Preservation guidelines had been approved. Archival assistance would continue, and researchers would have access to copies of the documents while the original collection remained safely inside the station where it belonged. Thomas slowly set the papers down. "So they all finally get remembered." Rachel nodded. "Exactly the way they should." Ben quietly removed his hat and looked around the observation room. "They would have liked that," he said. Not because anyone praised them, because the work wasn't forgotten. Later that afternoon, Thomas walked alone through the archive storage room one final time, checking shelves that had once been buried beneath dust. Every cabinet had been cleaned, every photograph cataloged, every report protected. The steel box that had revealed forgotten weather reports now rested empty beside carefully labeled archival cases. He paused before the antique barometer where the missing journal had been found. The hidden compartment remained slightly open, intentionally left that way so no future caretaker would overlook it again. Thomas smiled gently before closing the panel. As he returned to the main station, he noticed the sunlight stretching across the observation floor exactly as it had on the day he first walked inside, carrying nothing except uncertainty and exhaustion. The difference now was not the building. It was himself. When his business collapsed, he believed everything valuable in his life had disappeared. Losing the company had felt like losing his purpose. Yet standing inside the weather station, surrounded by 80 years of faithful work recorded by strangers, he finally understood something the journals had quietly taught him from the beginning. A meaningful life was not measured by financial success, public recognition, or titles printed on business cards. It was measured by showing up, doing honest work, helping others when possible, and leaving something worthwhile behind. The observers had understood that lesson long before he did. Their names appeared in no history books. Few people remembered them individually. Yet countless families had benefited from their patience, discipline, and willingness to perform ordinary tasks with extraordinary consistency. Their legacy had never been fame. It had always been service. Lisa arrived shortly before sunset, carrying a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "I thought you might need this," she said. Inside rested a new leather-bound journal, blank except for a single handwritten label she had carefully attached to the cover. It simply read, Volume 81. Thomas looked at her with quiet emotion. "Are you sure?" She smiled. "Someone has to continue the record." Rachel glanced toward the shelves where the earlier journals rested together. "The tradition never belonged to one person," she said softly. "It belonged to whoever was willing to care for it." Ben nodded in agreement. "Just like it always did." Thomas carried the new journal to the observation desk, where the first open volume had waited for him months earlier. He placed it beside the restored weather instruments and opened the blank first page. Outside, the mountains stretched peacefully beneath a wide autumn sky. Clouds drifted slowly above distant forests, while a cool breeze moved gently around the old observation tower. Thomas checked the thermometer mounted outside the window, noted the barometric pressure from the restored instrument, observed the cloud cover. and smiled as he realized the routine felt strangely familiar, despite being his first time recording it. Taking a fountain pen from the desk drawer, he carefully wrote the date. Beneath it, he entered the temperature, wind conditions, cloud observations, and the remaining measurements exactly as generations of observers had done before him. Then, below the weather data, he paused for a moment before adding one final sentence in steady handwriting. Today I became the caretaker of this station, grateful for everyone who came before me, and committed to ensuring their work will never be forgotten. He closed the journal gently, looked once more across the shelves filled with 80 years of quiet dedication, and watched the evening light settle over the mountain where one forgotten weather station had patiently waited for the right person to continue its story. As Thomas closed the journal, he realized the greatest inheritance he had received was never the old weather station itself. It was the quiet example left behind by ordinary people who showed up every single day, knowing that their work might never be recognized, yet choosing to do it with care anyway. His business had collapsed, but his purpose had not. Sometimes life doesn't end when one chapter closes. It simply leads us to the story we were always meant to find. If this story reminded you that no act of kindness, dedication, or perseverance is ever truly wasted, let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more remarkable stories about ordinary people who leave extraordinary legacies. Until next time, thank you for watching.